Abba, one of the world's most legendary pop bands, carried secrets that even their biggest fans never truly understood. Even before the world ever saw the cracks, the band was already breaking behind closed doors. They weren't just bandmates, they were couples, bound by marriage. And when those marriages collapsed in divorces that shocked millions, the countdown to the end had already begun. Decades after that quiet separation, Benny Andersson finally admitted the truth about why they quietly separated and the heartbreaking impact it had on him. The rise of ABBA. They had the glitter, the harmonies, and the kind of songs that made the whole world sing. Abba looked untouchable on stage, with their smiling faces, dazzling outfits, and hit after hit. But behind those perfect pop melodies, the people making the music were living through pressures, rivalries, and personal battles that fans never saw. And when the group eventually walked away from the spotlight, the reasons were about struggles that cut far deeper than anyone imagined. Abba's story began with Benny Andersson, who fell in love with music at just 6 years old when he was gifted an accordion. This instrument immediately changed the rhythm of his childhood, and unlike many children who drop hobbies quickly, Benny stayed glued to his accordion, experimenting with different sounds and rhythms long after his lessons were supposed to end. By the time he turned 10, another instrument caught his imagination: the piano. The family managed to bring one into the home, and Benny's curiosity exploded. Without formal lessons, he began teaching himself to play by ear, listening to records and copying what he heard. He was drawn to Elvis Presley's "Treat Me Nice," a track that made its way across the Atlantic and into Swedish living rooms. This influence might have seemed an unlikely recipe for a Swedish teenager in the 1950s, but it created the foundation of a musician who would one day blend folk, pop, and disco into a style the entire world would recognize. Benny's focus on music grew so strong that school started to feel unnecessary. At 15, he made the decision to leave formal education behind and devote himself entirely to music. But he wasn't alone in this adventure. He had a girlfriend, Christina Grunwald, who also loved to sing. The two performed together in a band called Elverkets Spelmanslag, and their relationship was serious enough that they started a family while still very young, raising 2 children together even as Benny's career was beginning to take shape. In 1964, Benny joined the Hep Stars, Sweden's most popular rock band of the 1960s. Often referred to as the Swedish answer to the Beatles, the Hep Stars caused hysteria among teenagers, packing concert halls and topping the charts. With his blonde hair and youthful energy, Benny quickly became a teen idol. But he wasn't just a face on stage, he was the band's creative force. He wrote songs that climbed to #1 and cemented his reputation as a gifted songwriter with an ear for catchy melodies. 2 years later, in 1966, Benny crossed paths with Björn Ulvaeus, who was then a member of the folk-influenced group, the Hootenanny Singers. Björn had a background in traditional Swedish music, while Benny was coming from rock and roll and pop. When they sat down together, their styles meshed instantly, and what began as casual songwriting sessions quickly turned into a full creative partnership. By 1969, fate brought more key players into the picture. Benny and Björn met singers Agnetha Fältskog and Annie Frid Lyngstad, 2 women who not only had striking voices, but also would become romantically involved with the 2 men. The chemistry was immediate, both personally and musically. They experimented with performing as a group under the name Festfolk, a clever pun in Swedish that meant both party people and engaged couples. The name didn't stick, but the partnership did. In 1974, the group signed up for Eurovision with a song that would change everything: Waterloo. Their performance in Brighton, England, complete with flashy costumes and a campy sense of fun, stood out from the competition. And when they were announced as the winners, it launched the band onto the international stage overnight. The years that followed turned them into one of the most successful groups in music history. With Benny and Björn driving the songwriting and production, and Agnetha and Annie Fried delivering powerhouse vocals, Abba created a catalog of hits that defined the 1970s. Over time, their record sales exceeded 150 million worldwide, securing their place among the best-selling acts ever. Benny's role was central. His keyboard arrangements shaped the band's distinctive sound, merging the catchy lightness of Europop with the groove of disco and the emotional punch of ballads. He pushed production techniques forward, layering harmonies and instruments in a way that felt lush, but still radio-friendly. Outside the music itself, ABBA leaned into style and presentation. Their glittering costumes, choreographed performances, and pioneering use of music videos helped build their global image and set trends that other artists would soon follow. Yet behind the success, the emotional costs were mounting. Fame brought wealth and adoration, but it also brought pressure, scrutiny, and strain on the relationships that had fueled the band in the first place. As the hits piled up, so did the personal challenges, and this set the stage for struggles that would eventually force ABBA off the stage. The emotional toll of fame. Abba looked unstoppable on stage, but what the audience didn't see was how much it cost to keep that image shining. The band demanded endless touring, relentless media appearances, and studio sessions that left little time for private lives. Sadly, each of the four members was dealing with personal struggles that built up quietly while the cameras focused on their smiles. In the 1970s, Abba's schedule took them across Europe, the United States, and even to faraway markets like Japan and Australia. They were expected to deliver flawless performances every night, no matter the jet lag or the personal problems they carried with them. Hotels replaced homes, and press conferences replaced quiet evenings. Even when they weren't on stage, they were being asked about their relationships, their clothes, and their future plans, with very little chance to step back and breathe. Annie Fried, known to fans simply as Frida, carried a different weight than the rest of the group. During Abba's busiest years, she endured personal tragedies, including the loss of close family members. And while grief would normally allow someone to step away and process in private, she rarely had that luxury. Night after night, she was expected to step into glittering costumes, walk onto stages filled with thousands of cheering fans, and perform songs that radiated joy, even when she was struggling to hold herself together. The gap between her public image and her private reality grew wider with each tour, and that strain stayed with her long after the applause ended. The group's personal relationships, which had once seemed like an extension of their harmony on stage, also began to fracture under the demands of constant work and public attention. Björn Ulvaeus and Agnetha Fältskog had married in 1971, before the world knew the name Abba, and at the time they looked like a perfect couple, balancing love, music, and family. As the years passed and the band's fame grew, the fairy tale image cracked under the pressure of endless travel, the scrutiny of the press, and the challenge of raising children while living out of suitcases. By 1979, their marriage had ended in divorce. Fans who had invested emotionally in the band were stunned, and the media wasted no time turning their heartbreak into headlines. Benny Andersson and Frida had also built a relationship during Abba's rise, falling in love and marrying in 1978. Their wedding was seen as a bright moment in the band's story, another symbol of unity among the four members. Yet the same pressures that had weighed heavily on Björn and Agnetha soon reached them as well. Life on the road, the constant attention, and the lack of separation between personal and professional life chipped away at their marriage. By 1981, they too divorced, leaving the group in a fragile state where the bonds holding them together were as strained as the music they were still trying to create. Abba was never only a band. It was two couples tied together in ways that blurred the line between business and family. When those marriages ended, it reshaped the dynamic of the entire group, These divorces could not be hidden behind closed doors, and in fact, they bled directly into the music. Abba had always been admired for the way they captured emotion in their songs, but after the separations, the lyrics became sharper, more personal, and often more painful. Knowing Me, Knowing You carried the weight of a relationship ending with quiet resignation, while The Winner Takes It All, performed by Agnetha, resonated like a raw confession, sung as someone who had lived every line. Fans connected with these songs in a way few pop acts had managed before, because this was music that reflected the very real experiences of the people performing it. By the start of the 1980s, the spark that had fueled Abba's creative energy for nearly a decade was beginning to dim. Recording sessions that once felt exciting now became heavy and emotionally draining, with every decision colored by the history each member carried into the studio. What should have been playful collaboration often turned into silence or tense exchanges, and even the simplest choices about arrangements or lyrics felt loaded with meaning. The public continued to embrace Abba with the same enthusiasm, filling concert halls and buying their records in staggering numbers. But the energy within the band was no longer the same. They had poured so much of themselves into their music and into each other that by 1981 their reserves were nearly empty. Fame had elevated them into icons, but it had also left them drained, scarred, and uncertain about how much longer they could continue. As these personal struggles quietly shaped the final years of their career, it wasn't the only problem. Abba's phenomenal success had drawn admiration, but it also attracted criticism, rumors, and controversies that threatened to overshadow the music itself, forcing the group to defend their reputation at the very height of their fame. Abba's controversies. Now here's the part of ABBA's story that a lot of fans outside Sweden never realized. While the world was screaming for encores and buying their records by the millions, back home in Sweden, the reaction wasn't always so warm. In fact, ABBA were often treated like outsiders in their own country. The problem wasn't their talent. Nobody could deny that Benny, Björn, Agnetha, and Frida could write a melody that stuck in your head for days. The problem was image. Sweden in the 1970s was leaning heavily toward political folk music, gritty guitar-driven rock, and, soon enough, the explosion of punk. Audiences were looking for rebellion, rawness, and music with a cause. But when Abba came along with their polished pop, sparkling outfits, and choreography that looked more like a variety show than a protest rally, it struck a nerve. To critics, ABBA became the symbol of everything that seemed wrong with mainstream pop. They were called commercial, soulless, and artificial. It didn't matter that their songs were musically sophisticated or that they were pouring real emotion into their work. What mattered to the Swedish press was that ABBA looked like they were chasing stardom instead of social change. The backlash didn't stay limited to magazine columns either. In 1975, Stockholm saw something extraordinary. Hundreds of thousands of people gathered in protest against the Eurovision Song Contest. There were entire stadiums worth of people crowding the streets, waving banners, and chanting in opposition. And while the protest wasn't solely about ABBA, they became the undeniable face of the debate. After all, Eurovision had launched them into global superstardom, and for critics, they represented the slick commercial side of music that Eurovision embodied. The Swedish media sharpened the knives further. Articles labeled them the enemy of authentic music, a band that was diluting artistry for the sake of record sales. And so, while they were topping charts in the United States, Australia, and Japan, their own local press was mocking them as if they were nothing more than a marketing machine. It created a bizarre double life where ABBA were international icons, but at home, they were constantly having to defend their legitimacy. Another problem was also the way Agnetha was treated. She wasn't just one of the most recognizable voices in pop. She was also relentlessly objectified. Tabloids zoomed in on her appearance, her figure, and even her private life, reducing her talent to headlines about her looks. This was so invasive and exhausting. While she was coping with the anxiety of performing, balancing motherhood, and dealing with the end of her marriage to Björn, the press made her beauty into a sideshow. Abba's image as a whole didn't escape ridicule either. Their flamboyant outfits and bright stage costumes were playful, yes, but they became easy targets in an era where ripped jeans and leather jackets were the markers of authenticity. Critics dismissed their glitter and platform boots as superficial, ignoring the fact that their look was part of the magic that made them so recognizable. But today, what critics saw as ridiculous has now become iconic, forever tied to the global memory of the 1970s. And while the band was accused of being shallow pop stars, their music was quietly evolving into something much deeper. By 1981, when Abba released their final studio album, The Visitors, the sound was darker, moodier, and filled with themes of tension and alienation. The album reflected not only the personal struggles of the band, but also a world growing more complicated politically. The album also hinted at surveillance and paranoia, and it didn't go unnoticed. In fact, in the Soviet Union, the entire album was banned for its political undertones. That censorship was almost surreal. Here was a band being accused of being lightweight and commercial on one side, and on the other, their music was considered so provocative it had to be silenced. This was the strange space ABBA occupied. They could never fully win. Too safe for one crowd, too dangerous for another. This contradiction weighed heavily on them. Fame had already taken its toll, with broken marriages and endless tours draining their energy. Now, with critics dismissing their art and tabloids twisting their image, the joy of being Abba was harder to hold on to. Fans around the world were still screaming their names, but inside the group, the pressures were mounting. By the early 1980s, the controversies weren't just noise in the background, they had become part of Abba's story. They were legends abroad and skeptics at home, adored by millions and scrutinized by their own press, praised for their melodies and mocked for their costumes, and branded as both harmless pop and political agitators. And that strange, conflicting energy followed them right up to their final years together. The silent separation. Abba's end wasn't marked by a dramatic press conference or a teary farewell concert. Instead, it unfolded quietly, almost like a curtain, lowering on a stage after the last song has been sung. By 1982, the four members were simply drifting apart, and fans didn't even realize that they had witnessed the final chapter of one of the biggest bands in music history. After The Visitors was released in 1981, there was no clear announcement that Abba was done. There were still promotional appearances and the occasional performance, but the fire that had once fueled their sessions was gone. The recording studio, once a place of laughter, excitement, and musical discovery, had started to feel like a room full of ghosts. The personal history between the members was also too heavy to ignore, and every lyric and harmony carried an invisible layer of tension. They were still professionals, still able to deliver songs that sounded flawless, but the joy of working together was no longer there. Rather than force themselves into continuing, they simply let the music stop. There were no big fights, no public meltdowns, or carefully crafted breakup announcements. Instead, they faded out in silence, which in some ways made their absence feel even more mysterious, because fans kept waiting for a new album, another tour, or at least an explanation, but none came. Björn Ulvaeus and Benny Andersson, the duo whose songwriting had built ABBA's catalog, found new excitement in the world of musicals. They poured their energy into projects like Chess and later Kristina från Duvemåla. These works showed that their talent for dramatic storytelling through music hadn't gone anywhere. It had simply found a different outlet. The shift allowed them to keep writing on a grand scale, without the strain of trying to maintain ABBA's fractured dynamic. Agnetha and Frida each pursued solo careers. For Agnetha, it was a chance to step out of the constant shadow of the band and find her own sound. She had been a superstar long before Abba, and going solo again allowed her to reconnect with that identity, even though the spotlight continued to follow her. For Frida, the solo path opened doors to work with new producers and experiment with styles that Abba's tight format had never allowed. Both women were still adored by fans, but now they had the freedom to sing songs that weren't weighed down by the complicated history of their bandmates. The absence of a formal breakup statement only fueled curiosity. Fans and journalists speculated endlessly, asking if the group might reunite or whether the silence was just a long pause. But Benny would later reflect on how deep the wounds really were. The emotions tied up in their marriages, divorces, and years of pressure made it impossible to carry on as if nothing had happened. The group wasn't destroyed by one dramatic blow, it dissolved slowly under the weight of everything they had endured together. Frida once explained it simply by saying that they had grown out of each other. It wasn't about hatred or scandal, but about life moving forward in separate directions. They had entered the 1970s as young couples chasing a dream and ended the decade as individuals who had weathered heartbreak, fame, and constant public attention. What made their silent separation so unusual was that most bands of their size and fame didn't bow out this way. The Beatles had messy headlines, Fleetwood Mac had public battles, but Abba slipped away almost invisibly with no final concert where fans could wave goodbye. And while the world was left to wonder, Benny Andersson himself was carrying more than his share of personal challenges. Away from the lights and awards, his private battles were shaping the next phase of his life in ways the public had only begun to suspect. Benny's personal struggles. Behind the polished performances and carefully staged television specials, Benny Andersson's personal life was unraveling in ways fans couldn't see. When his marriage to Annie Fried Lyngstad suddenly collapsed in 1981, it marked the beginning of his emotional problems. The split wasn't dragged out or filled with public arguments. Instead, it was quick and almost shocking. Benny had fallen for Mona Nurklet, a Swedish television producer, and by the end of that same year, he was remarried. On the surface, it looked like a clean break, but in reality, the emotional fallout was far heavier than anyone outside the band could imagine. Even though Benny and Frida remained on good terms, the divorce left scars that didn't fade. This wasn't just the end of a marriage, it was another fracture in the delicate balance of ABBA itself. Every time the band came together after that, the weight of those broken relationships lingered in the room silently, shaping the way the group worked and how each of them carried themselves. The end of his marriage was only one part of a larger struggle, because privately, Benny was dealing with alcoholism, an issue that would shadow him for years. It wasn't something he admitted publicly until 2011, decades after Abba's heyday. But the problem had been building during and after the group's career. Drinking dulled the stress, softened the edges of heartbreak, and numbed the constant noise of fame, but it came at a cost. Alcohol began to creep into his creative process, slowly undermining the sharp instincts that had made him one of the most innovative pop songwriters of his generation. The same man who had once sat for hours, layering melodies and experimenting with new sounds, found himself slipping into cycles where creativity became harder to access. Ideas that once came quickly were buried under self-doubt and distraction. Music had always been his outlet, but alcohol turned it into a battlefield. He kept working, but the shadows of addiction threatened to derail everything he had built. It was a fight that lasted years and required him to take a hard look at himself before he could truly move forward. Even with a new marriage and new projects, Benny carried his struggles quietly. He wasn't the kind of celebrity who paraded personal issues in public, and so much of what he went through remained hidden until long after the fact. This privacy made his eventual admission about alcoholism more striking. By the time he spoke openly in 2011, fans realized how much pain he had kept tucked away, even while giving the world music that sounded joyful, polished, and timeless. And then, in 2025, Benny was struck by another blow that reopened old wounds. Michael B. Trito, ABBA's longtime sound engineer and one of Benny's closest collaborators, passed away. To most fans, Trito's name might not be as recognizable as the four faces on stage, but his fingerprints were all over Abba's sound. He was the man in the studio helping Benny and Björn push the boundaries of pop production, turning layered harmonies and experiments with overdubbing into the glossy, full-bodied sound that defined the band. Without Trito, ABBA would not have sounded the way it did. Losing him wasn't just losing a colleague. It was losing a friend who had been there for every step of the journey. Their bond was built not only on music, but also on years of late nights, trial and error sessions, and the kind of creative trust that only comes when two people work side by side for so long. When Trito died, Benny was forced to confront the passage of time in the most painful way. The people who had shared that golden era with him were slipping away, and no amount of success could shield him from the grief. That loss reignited memories Benny had long kept buried, including the divorces, the band's slow unraveling, and the years lost to addiction. It pulled everything back into sharp focus. Even decades later, the emotional scars of ABBA's collapse hadn't healed completely. The music remained, the awards were still on the shelves, but the human cost of those years never disappeared. And after several years, Benny finally opened up about what really happened to ABBA and why they disappeared quietly. The tragic truth about ABBA. When Abba reappeared in 2021 with Voyage, their first studio album in 40 years, it felt like the world had been waiting for them all along. Fans who had grown up with their music lined up beside younger generations who had discovered Abba through movies, musicals, and viral clips. The album was about reconnecting with a story that had never really ended, and at the heart of it was Benny Andersson, carefully shaping the sound one more time. But Voyage wasn't just about nostalgia. Alongside the album came the Abba Voyage concert residency in London, where state-of-the-art avatars of the band performed as their younger selves. It was a technical marvel, and Benny had his fingerprints all over it. He had always been the architect of ABBA's sound, and now he was helping design a new way to keep the legacy alive without demanding the impossible from four people who had already given so much of themselves. Yet even in the glow of that triumphant return, Benny spoke openly in interviews about the price of everything that had come before. The glitter and success had always looked effortless from the outside, but inside, the toll was staggering. He explained that the breakup still haunted him and that the unraveling of the band wasn't something he could ever fully put behind him. For Benny, Abba wasn't just a career. It was a family, a marriage, and a dream all rolled into one. And watching it fracture left scars that never faded. The music had been a gift, one that connected millions of people across the world, but it had also been a burden. Every hit carried pieces of their private struggles. Every song about heartbreak or loss had roots in real pain that he and the others had lived through. And while the records sold in the hundreds of millions, the cost was measured in sleepless nights, broken marriages, and years of silence. Benny made it clear that ABBA was never only about making hits. It was also about surviving the crush of fame, the heartbreak of divorce, and the loneliness of being seen by millions yet understood by so few. It was also about growing older, learning to live with the past, and eventually finding some kind of peace in knowing the music still matters. The songs endure, the avatars light up a stage in London, and the fans keep singing along. But for Benny Andersson, the legend of ABBA will always be entwined with the cost of living it. What do you think? Why did ABBA really split? Let us know what you think in the comments below. And if you love juicy deep dives into celebrity lives, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that bell icon so you never miss a new video.